Let's in Masechet Zevachim is Daf Samach Gimel. We are up to the Mishnah. Um, she said, "Don't wait." I love it. Okay, we're up to the Mishnah on top. So remember this is a new parak, right? So last parak, of course, talked about where you shecht different karbanot, and we did the whole thing about the north and what is kol makom ba'azara, and now, of course, we're talking about kachei kadashim. And we finish sort of the animals and we get to the next thing. Now we're going to skip the birds for a second. We're going to discuss them, don't worry. But says our Mishnah, 4 lines from the top, minachot, the karban mincha, remember there are many different kinds of minchot that person would bring, and we're going to go through, of course, all of these in Masechet Minachot. That's not the place for Masechet Zevachim, but all kinds of karbanot mincha, which are all involve flour, most involve oil, they all involve some kind of hagasha, of either a kmitza on the mizbeach or you put it towards the mizbeach. There's a lot of different details, but minachot hayu b'chol makom ba'azara. The mincha, the kmitza of the mincha, which is essentially similar to, well, it's not so clear what it's similar to. We'll see, but maybe it's similar to the slaughtering of an animal, right? Because you're actually doing the main part, and then you put it on the mizbeach. Maybe, but the kmitza itself is done anywhere in the azara, so it doesn't have to be done specifically in the north, unlike other kachei kadashim. And when the mincha is eaten, which is the case for most minachot, nechlot lifnim min haklaim, has to be eaten inside the walls, meaning inside the Beit Hamikdash, Hainava. Lezichrei kahuna, it's eaten by the zicharim of the kahuna, just like kachei kadashim. That's what it is. B'chol ma'achal can mean in any way, which of course is a reference to how you make it, how you prepare it. L'yom v'layla ad chatzot, and it's for the day and the night. And like everything that we say, day and night, we say night only up to chatzot. And we talked earlier about that's probably a gzera, but it's the day you do it and the following night. Now, so that's the Mishnah. Now, how do we know that? It says Rabbi Elazar, I'm a Rabbi Elazar, mincha shenik mitzah behechal kshera. Before we start talking about how you know you can do a minchas kmitza anywhere in the Azara, Rabbi Elazar says a very interesting halacha, which is that if you do a kmitza inside the heichal, right? So remember, usually you're doing things in the chatzer, in the yard, outside where the mizbeach is, where everything is. Let's say you're standing inside the heichal and you do the kmitza, that's also kosher. Okay, now why? How do you know that? Says Rabbi Elazar a very interesting analogy, which is that if you think about the lechem hapanim that's done on the shulchan every week, right? That is a mincha. It's not a usual mincha. You don't take a kmitza with your hand, but you take a portion of that, which is the bezichim. Remember, on the shulchan, there was space for these cups of spices and incense, whatever they were, and they would be taken off and put on the mizbeach. So taking the siluk bezichim, taking out these bezichim, is the equivalent to taking a kmitza of the karban. You're taking a portion of that big karban, the karban being the lechem hapanim and the bezichim with them, and you're putting it on the mizbeach. But the act of taking off the bezichim is the act of kmitza, and that's obviously done in the heichal. That's where the bezichim were located. So you find matzino b'siluk bezichim that they are done inside the heichal, and so by analogy, you could say that every mincha can be done inside the heichal. It doesn't have to be, of course, but it can be done inside the heichal. Okay, so that is the limud for how you know that it can be done inside the heichal. We haven't yet learned how you know it can be done anywhere in the azara. That's the Rebbe Elazar. Matav Rabbi Yirmiyah asked Rabbi Yirmiyah, but what about this limud that we had earlier that it said mikamatz misham, right? It said you can take the kmitza from there, meaning it says the whole pasuk in the beginning of Vayikra is you bring the karban up to the kohen. The kamatz misham, he takes the kmitza, bring it up, bnei Aaron kohanim. The kamatz misham alo kumso. So you see from there that the kohen takes it from the Yisrael, meaning min makom shraglei hazar omdot. Right? You take it from the place where the zar is standing, which implies, no, it's not so clear what this question exactly is, but it basically implies that you can do it anywhere in the azara, not just inside, or not only not just inside, but you can't do it inside the heichal, because a zar is never allowed to walk inside the heichal, right? So if there has to be a kmitza from a place where a zar can walk up to, it shouldn't be allowed to be done within the heichal. That's presumably the question. Ben Betera Omer, the Betera continues, and this is the Braita that Rabbi Elazar was quoting, Minayin shim kamatz v'smol, shiachzir v'yikmotz bimin. How do you know that if you do a kmitza on the left hand, remember we had this earlier, that you're supposed to do all the avodah with your right hand? What if you did, now remember, if you shecht an animal with your left hand, you can't re-shecht the animal with your right hand, because that is not the way animals live, right? You can't redo it. But what if you do a kmitza with your left hand, that you can put the flour back into the pot, And yachzir v'yikmotz bimin, you can do a do-over. Talmud lomar misham, right? We learned it from the pasuk misham, telling you, but kamatz misham is not that you take it from the Yisrael, it's mimakom shekamatz kvar. It's from the place that you already took a kmitza, meaning do a kmitza. If you do it wrong, you can go put it back and do it again. And so Misham might not tell you, this might be an answer, it might not tell you that you can do a kmitza specifically from the hand of the Yisrael, meaning they can't be in the Heichal. It means that if you messed up, made a mistake when you did the kmitza, you can put it back in and do it again. Now, Igadami, some have a little bit of a different version of this back and forth, where hu motivla, Rabbi Yirmiyah asked a question, hu mefarekla, and Rabbi Yirmiyah himself answered the question that, oh, bikamatz misham does not mean that you have to take a kmitza from the Yisrael, meaning from somewhere where a zar can walk. It means you can redo it if you make a mistake. And now, Ikadami, some say that Amrle Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, Rabbi Akiva says Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Tachlifa, that in fact, Asberlecha, it's not a question. Your question was, how could you say that you do a kmitza inside the Heichal? The pasuk says "Mikamatz misham," which implies you have to be able to take it from the Yisrael. All that means is lo nitzrucha elahachshir kol hazara kula. In fact, what the pasuk is there to say is that you can take it from any place in the Azara, meaning not only where Yisrael can go, but even anywhere Yisrael can go. So it's not only parts of the Azara, like very close in, near the Kodesh, near the Mizbeach, but anywhere in the Azara is kosher for doing a mincha, and that turns out to be the source of our Mishnah. So anywhere in the Azara ultimately is kosher to do a karban mincha. Now, why do you need a pasuk to tell you that? Because says Rabbi Akiva, says the Gemara, I would have thought Hov ola kache kadashim. Look, an ola, as opposed to a shlamim, right, is in the category of kache kadashim. It has all the rules about psul with tful yom and the rules of kohanim eating it. Well, not an ola, but of it not being eaten for anyone else. But tful yom is the main one here. And it is the category of kache kadashim. Mincha, we said before, and we're going to keep saying, is also kache kadashim. So you might have thought that, we learned one from the other. It's a hekesh. Ma ola tu not safon. It's not a hekesh, it's a mamatzina, right? Ma ola tu not safon. Just like these things are similar. And ola needs to be done in the north, and we brought that from the pasuk of shachad oto yeracham mizbeach tzafona, right? Just like an ola needs to be in the north, af mincha tu not safon. So I would have thought that a karban mincha has to have its process, meaning it's kmitza, done in the north of the Azara. So that's why you need a pasuk. Says Gemara, that's not. Why would you need a pasuk? Mala ola shkin kalil. How would you have ever said, if the rule is true by an ola, let's learn it out to a mincha? An ola is clearly a much more, holy or limited karban, because the whole thing is burnt. A mincha, you take it and you eat it. So maybe it's not as strict and you can do it anywhere. Says Gemara, you're right, but I would have thought mechatat, right? A chatat is also kache kadashim. It's eaten by the kohanim, and it has to be done in the north, right? Which we learned from the Ola. So why don't you learn from the Chatat that just like a Chatat is Kodesh Kadashim and it's done in the north, a Mincha is Kodesh Kadashim and it's done in the north, and that's why we need a pasuk. That's not a good question either, because Malach Chatat came kritot. A Chatat can come for someone who does really severe sins, a Chiyuv Karet, like Shabbos or Avodah Zarah even, right? You can bring a Karban Chatat to get atonement. A Mincha, remember, there are Minachot that come for Olevi, Oreid, and other things, but there's no mincha that comes for a chiyuv karet, right? If a person's mechalal Shabbat, for sure, they have to bring a karban chatat. And if they can't afford it, they got to wait and save up money, right? They can't bring a mincha. So you would have never learned out from a chatat to a mincha. A chatat is clearly a stricter animal, a stricter forgiveness than a mincha. So it's like, okay, about me Asham. Think about an Asham. An Asham definitely comes for things that are not so certain. For example, you bring an Asham for Me'ila, or you bring an Asham for even a Safek, right? An Asham that is done for uncertainty, or other Ashamot. So maybe you learn from an Asham. An Asham is Kodesh Kodashim, as we learned before. It has to be done in the north, and so too you would have thought Ichatat has to be Mincha has to be done in the north. Doesn't matter, but that's not a question either, because everybody would understand that an Asham is stricter than a Mincha, because Mala Asham shekain minei damim. Right? Asham is blood. Everyone knows that blood is, everyone knows about sacrifice, knows that you're bringing blood. It's much more, primal and deep than if you're just bringing some flour. So you would have never thought, and everyone intuitively feels that way, right? That a karban, when you're slaughtering an animal and pouring it on the mizbeach, is a bigger, quote unquote, sacrifice, a bigger gift than a mincha. So I would never have learned out from Asham to Mincha. And of course, if you're going to go and say, well, you got three things that are in the north, Ola, Chatat, and Asham, let's do a Maratzad. What's similar between them? They're all Kodesh Kodashim. But in fact, that's not true because Malakulanch came Minei Damim. They are all Minei Damim, right? So you would have never, just from the fact that you know that all these animals have to be done in the north, you would have never thought to conclude that Mincha should also be done in the north and therefore need a pasuk to say that it can be done anywhere. So why do you need a pasuk to tell me that the Karban Mincha can be done anywhere? Why would you have thought otherwise? Says Gemara, it's because of a whole different reason. Ela Itzrach. You do need a pasuk to tell you that the Mincha can be done anywhere in the Azara. Because I might have thought, oh, yeah, remember when it describes how you bring the Mincha, this is way back in the beginning of Vayikra, it says you give it to the Kohen, we read that pasuk before, the Higisha El HaMizbeach. And he brings it up to the Mizbeach. And then later, it's the pasuk in Tzav, it says, "Ve'erim mimenu b'kumso." He takes on the mizbeach the komets and he puts it on the fire, or whatever he puts it. We're going to see. And he brought it to the mizbeach. So you might have thought that just like ma hagasha, just like the hagasha, right? When it says you bring it to the mizbeach, you have to literally put it and touch or be near the mizbeach. We're going to learn in the next Mishnah in a couple of minutes that was done. The hagasha was done by Karen Maravit Dromit. That was done on the southwestern corner of the Mizbeach. And again, orientation is super important here. If you're walking up the Mizbeach, right, you're walking up the ramp, you're coming from the south and facing the north. So the west is on your left towards the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodashim. So that's where you have to bring the mincha. You have to bring every mincha to that, again, walking up the ramp to your left next to you, which is the Karen Maravit Dromit. So you might have thought, just like the Hagasha of the mincha has to be done by the Mizbeach, which of course is in very close to the Kodesh and very far into the Azara. Av Kemitza b'Karen Maravit Dromit. So the Kemitza should be done at the same place, right? Meaning you should basically remember what they used to do is they took the container with the mincha, they would do a Kemitza, put that Kemitza into another pan or another container and bring that container to the Mizbeach. So you might have thought that those things are connected, that just like the Hagasha has to be the Karen Maravit Dromit, the Kemitza has to be done by Karen Maravit Dromit, and it can't be done anywhere else in the Azara. It can't be done anywhere you want. It has to be done specifically in that place. Kamash Malan. And that's why we have a pasuk that says that you can do it, that you take it from Nazar, that basically anywhere a Zar can go, which is anywhere in the Azara, not anywhere, but some places in the Azara, the Mincha can have the Kemitza done in that place. And so that is basically the limit for our Mishnah. Now, we're going to get to this next mission in a second, but before we get there, Rabbi Yochanan has something that he wants to tell us. So says Rabbi Yochanan, where are we? I don't know how to find this place. It's around a little more than halfway down. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Shlamim, now, right, we just mentioned that there's a mincha that is done inside the Kodesh, and that mincha is called the Lechem HaPanim, right? Every Shabbat, they would switch out the Lechem HaPanim, they would take the Bezichim, the spice things off of the shulchan, and they would put them on the mizbeach, and that was the korban of lechem hapanim, and then the kohanim would eat the lechem hapanim. We're going to discuss this all in minachot, right? But it says Rabbi Yochanan, I want to tell you something very interesting, that it's not just the mincha that can be done inside the heichal. If let's say, I don't know, it's raining or snowing, and you want to do your korban inside the heichal, it sounds like it'd be very messy, but shlamim sheshachtam beheichal ksherim, right? Remember, shlamim can be done anywhere in the Azara. Right? Let's say you bring it into the Heichal and shecht it inside the Heichal, that would be kosher. How do you know that? Shenemar, because we've learned, and we learned this before last week, v'shachatu petach ohel moed. You shecht the shlamim in front of the doorway of the ohel moed. Remember, we learned all last week that the doors have to be open, and if the doors are shut, or if it's behind the Beit HaMikdash, there has to be a door there in order for there to still be access. But you see that it's done outside the door of the Ohel Moed. But of course, the inside is even greater, right? The whole point is the Ohel Moed has to be open so that the Ohel Moed can see you do the shechita. But certainly, if you do it inside, lo yehei tafel chamer min ha'ikar. You can't say that tafel, meaning the entranceway, the opening of the Ohel Moed, is stricter, is harsher than the Ohel Moed itself. And so since the whole purpose of shechting it is that it has to be with Nei Petach Ohel Moed, certainly if you do it in the Ohel Moed, it will be kosher. That's Rabbi Yochanan's limud, okay? Ask the Gemara, it's not so obvious. Meitvei, it says in a Braita, right, which of course would be a question of Rabbi Yochanan. The Girsa here is a little bit confused because our Girsa says Meitvei Rabbi Yochanan ben Beter Omer, which is a name that is not very familiar to anybody. I don't know if we ever have Rabbi Yochanan ben Betera. And of course, on the side, I don't know if it's on everyone else's side, but on my side, it says Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, right? Or Mativ Rabbi Yochanan. So it depends on who's asking. But I think it's simplest to change it to Mativ Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera from a Braita, Omer. Minayin She'im Hakifo Goyim et Kol Hazara. This is a very interesting Gemara. How do you know? And this, of course, was not so uncommon at the end of the Second Beit HaMikdash, sadly, when they were fighting constant battles back and forth with both with internally with other Jews, but also with the Romans. How do you know that if the Ovdei Kochavim, I don't know if Charlie has a different girsa from Ovdei Kochavim, but how do you know if the people, right, are fighting a war and they're basically surrounding the Azara and they're shooting arrows or guns into the Azara, so it's not very safe to stand there and do the karbanot, right? Now, as we know, the Kohanim tried to do the avodah until the last minute. How do you know that if that's the case and it's unsafe to be in the open courtyard, that the Kohanim can be nichnasim l'sham, they can go into the Kodesh, right, into the Heichal, v'ochlim sham kachei kadashim, and they can eat their karbanot there, right? Torah says you can eat your karban only in the Azara, right? And we talked before, they would sit in the open space, they would sit behind the Kodesh HaKodashim because there was a doorway, right? Maybe, we said we didn't actually need the doorway. Anyways, they would sit anywhere in the Azara and eat their food. But if it wasn't safe, how do you know that they can go inside and eat it inside? Talmud Omer, therefore, there's a pasuk that says, "B'kodesh hakadashim tochlenu," that you can eat it b'kodesh hakadashim, which we learn to mean even inside the kodesh, not just in a holy place, but in the holiest of places, right? Now says the Gemara, according to Rabbi Yochanan, why do you need this braita? Amai, why don't you say, according to Rabbi Yochanan, look, you can eat it outside, and the outside is only an outside of the inside. So for sure, you can eat it inside. Rabbi Yochanan said it's logical that if you shecht an animal in the chatzar, lifnei olam moed, you could for sure shecht it inside the olam moed. So why would you say the same thing about eating? If you can eat outside, right, it says, b'chatzar olam moed yochlu, eat it in the courtyard of the olam moed. So according to Rabbi Yochanan's logic, you should say, and for sure, you eat it inside the olam moed. Lo yehei tafel chamor min ha'ikar. The tafel, the outside space, meaning the chatzar, shouldn't be stricter than the ikar, which is the inside space. So I don't get Rabbi Yochanan. How could Rabbi Yochanan say that it's logical that anything that could be done outside of the Olam Moed can actually be done inside the Olam Moed? It's not true. By eating, we need a pasuk to tell me that you're allowed to eat inside. So, of course, the pasuk tells me that, but that doesn't mean you can say that by anything where the pasuk doesn't tell you. And how do you know that you can shecht an animal inside? Says the Gemara, well, Rabbi Yochanan would answer you that it's very different. Hachi hashna. Look, this is not the same case because hatam, by shechting an animal, that's avodah, right? That is the service of the karban. So it's logical that avodah the adam oved b'makom rabo, that if a person wants to do avodah, hatam avodah, right? There it's referring to avodah. The adam oved b'makom rabo. It's logical that a person does worship and shows, part of the avoda in front of their master, meaning in front of God in this case. So there you would say, Amrinan lo yehei tafel chamor min ha'ikar. That there, if you can do the avodah for Hashem outside the Olam Moed, you for sure can do avodah inside the Olam Moed. But by eating, hacha, achila, dein adam ochel b'makom rabo. Right, eating is very different. Right, the avodah is shechting the animal, but eating, you wouldn't say the same thing. Lo yehei tafel chamor min ha'ikar, lo amrinan. Right, you would never say, "Oh, I can eat in the courtyard of the palace, so I can for sure eat inside, the throne room or something." Like, clearly, eating, which is not the main part of the avodah, of course, it isn't a part of the avodah, but it's not the main thing. Rashi says it's ziluta. It's it's a low. It's benefiting. It's a lower class thing. So there, it doesn't make any sense to say that because on the opposite, you can't say, "Oh, I'm allowed to eat outside. I can for sure eat inside." So there, you need a pasuk to include it. As you might have thought, oh, the Olam Moed is so kadosh, it's so the presence of God. You can't eat in the Olam Moed the way we don't eat in a shul, or we don't eat in holy places. So therefore, the pasuk comes to say you can eat in the Olam Moed, which is a chiddush. But by shechita, we don't need a pasuk for that, according to Rabbi Yochanan, because it's logical. You're worshiping Hashem, and if you can worship Hashem outside, in a case where you need to, you can even do it inside. So that's Rabbi Yochanan's limud, and I presume that's how we paskin. Of course, it's not relevant right now, but that's it. Continues now, we're up to the Mishnah. At the bottom, near the bottom of Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, one of Nava's favorite locations, which is the Keren of the southeast side, where there was no Keren, right? So says the Mishnah, Chatat ha'of. Now, the next case, right, is we're talking about the bird. So we just talked about a mincha. Now we get to the bird. Says the Mishnah, you take a chatat ha'of, right? Chatat ha'of is often done. There's different cases where you bring a chatat ha'of, but the most likely case is where you are poor, right? And you have to bring, well, actually that's a olat, that's a mincha ha'of, but chatat of a mincha, right? Let's get to the case. But chatat ha'of, which there are cases in the pasuk, of course, of bringing a chatat with a bird. So that is done. Hayta naset akeren dromit maravit. Okay, that was processed on the southwest corner, and again, I'll do it every time if I can. When you walk up this ramp, which you're walking up from the south, it's to your left. Now, remember, we learned last week, was it last week or yesterday? I don't remember. I guess it was yesterday, that you always go right, right? I taught it last week by myself, but we learned it yesterday, that when you walk up that ramp, you always turn to the right. So you don't generally turn to the left, which would be the southwest. You turn to the southeast, then the northeast, then the northwest, and then the southwest, right? So you basically are going to have to walk. I don't know how many amot that is in the perimeter, but I can do the math. It's a lot. It's around 100 amot altogether if you think about the ramp and everything, right? So you're basically running, a big race just to get up there to that side. So it's generally done a karen dromit maravit. Now says the Mishnah, we're going to see this as a contradiction. B'chol makom haytak shera. Really, you can do the chatat ha'of, meaning you can do the malika, you can cut off the head of the chatat ha'of anywhere. That's where they used to do it. And the Gemara is going to ask, what does that mean, right? Now, but before we get to that, says the Mishnah, 5 lines from the bottom, Shlosha dvarim hayta oto karen mishameshet. There were 3 specific avodot that were done only on that karen, the left, right? When you walk up the ramp to the left, the karen maravit dromit, southwestern corner. And what were those 3 things? The 3 things were, wait a minute. 3 things below the chod hasikra, ushlosha milamala, and 3 things above, so 6 altogether. What was done milamata? So one was a chatat ha'of. The carbon chatat ha'of, the chatat ha'of has to be sprinkled, or not sprinkled, smeared on the mizbeach, below the chod hasikra, on that corner, on the southwest corner, okay? Hagashot, when you bring a mincha to the mizbeach, you bring it close, you bring it to that corner, as we just saw before. Ushiyarei hadam, and the special halacha that when you had extra blood, you would pour it down. It was poured. Remember, we had this in the Mishnayot before. You poured it on the karen maravit maravit dromit. Okay, those were 3 done below. Umila malan, the 3 done at the top of the mizbeach, meaning above the or above the chod hasikra. Nisuch hayayin v'hamayim. When they poured wine with every karban, and when they poured water on Sukkot, that was done in, remember we said there was a space open initially, and then they filled it in, and there were pipes going down into the deeps of the drains, but that was poured on the southwestern corner. Ve'olat ha'of kashi rabba b'mizrach. And when there were a lot of people in the Mizrach, right? So meaning there was a lot of business going on, there were hundreds and hundreds of people coming for olat ha'of, they would also do that. They had to do it in the southeast. If they couldn't do it in the southeast, they would do it on the southwest. Okay, now we're going to discuss all this in the Gemara. Says the Mishnah, though, just to clarify, Kol ha'olin l'mizbeach. Every time you go up to the mizbeach, olin derech yamin. You would generally go up on the right side of the ramp. Remember, the ramp of the mizbeach was 16 amot across, which is, around 25 feet, so pretty wide. You would walk up the right side and turn the page, umakifin, you would encircle, when you went around, basically, you would go to the right, and you would go to the right, which again is the southeastern corner. Then you go around to the northeastern, northwestern, and then southwestern corner. V'yordim derech small. And when you came down, you would go down the left. Well, it's now the left side of the ramp. Of course, when you're walking down, you're facing the right. But if you're facing the ramp, it's the left side of the ramp. So that's generally the way it was done. You would walk up, you'd make the circle. It was very clear. There was, traffic in one direction, pretty much what we call counterclockwise, the way we drive in America, right? So that was the way the traffic worked on the Mizbeach. Chutz min ha'oleh l'shlosha elu. Except for these 3 exceptions. And that was, if you're going to put the karban, or you're going to put the thing on the left side of the Mizbeach, right? Meaning you go up and you're going to do it on the karen dromit maravit, then don't walk all the way around to get there, because then you're walking, 100 feet just to get to something, which you can walk up and turn to the left, and it's 5 feet away from you, or 5 amot away from you. So in those cases, those shayu olin v'yordin al ha'akev, You would go up the left side, basically. You put it on, you go to the left, unlike usually where you go to the right. You put it down on the Mizbeach, and then you go back down right away. So basically, we saved a lot of traffic by making a shorter route. Waze was very popular, right, with those carbonot, and you would go up and you would go to the left. Okay, so that is the Mishnah. The Gemara is going to discuss this in some detail, but that's the halachot of the Mishnah. Now, says the Gemara now at the top of Daf Samach Gimel Amud, right at the beginning of the Gemara, third line, Minani Mili. How do you know that a mincha, sorry, an ola, a chata ta'of, a bird that's a karban chatat, is placed on this spot, right? How do you know that it's put on the southwestern corner? Is that right? Yeah, the dromit maravit. How do you know that? Amar Rabbi Yeshua, Amar Krab, because the pasuk says, this is referring to it's referring to the karban of a olevi ored, of a poor person. It says, lo yasim aleh shaman, when the poor person brings his mincha, he shouldn't place oil on it, because remember, it's a minchat chote, right? V'lo yitain aleh levona, don't put spices on it, don't make it appealing. Ki chatat hi, right? It is a chatat, which is an extra word. So basically, they could have just said, just do it, because whatever, it is what it is. Why is it ki chatat hi? It's to tell you, to compare chatat kriya mincha and mincha kriya chatat, to tell you that there's basically connections back and forth between a karban chatat, and we're going to see which chatat in a second, and a karban mincha. So there's cases where a mincha has the rules of a chatat, and cases where a chatat has the rule of a mincha. What are the rules? So the first one, I'm just going to read what's in our Gemara. Rashi says this is a gross mistake, okay? I'll read. Rashi's words are Yodea ani shegirsazu shibush. So I'm very confident that the next words are a mistake, but I'm going to read them and I'll explain what Rashi says. That how do you the chatat ima chatat sunat safon, just like a chatat has to be done in the north when it's shechted, af mincha tunat safon. So too a mincha has to be done in the north. Now that's wrong. And the way we know that's wrong is because we learned the Mishnah today that earlier that a mincha can be done anywhere. So obviously it doesn't mean that. So Rashi says it's a mistaken girsa, and that if you look at the same Braita in Menachot, which is probably the source of this, there's a different, the Braita says something completely different. It says, Ma chatat is pasul shelo lishma, af mincha pasul shelo lishma, which makes a lot more sense. So Rashi says, I'm not really sure how this girsa got in here, and who did this mistake, but someone made a mistake, and that's really what it should say. Okay, it still says what it says, but that's what it should say. So that is the first part. That's not why we're quoting the Braita. We're quoting it for the second part. Ma mincha, just like the mincha has to be done, the Karen Maravit Dromit, just like every minchat chote has to be done in the southwest corner of the Mizbeach. We don't know how we know that yet, but everybody knows that. Af chatat, so to a chatat ha'of, is Bekaren Maravit Dromit. Has to be done on the southwest corner. So that's the limud from this pasuk. Ask the Gemara, how do you know the mincha? Right, so you said just like the mincha has to be done on the southwest, so too the oaf has to be done. But mincha gufa minalan, what's the source for the mincha? That is because, this is very interesting, when it says bring the mincha of the chatat, it says bring the mincha, not any mincha really here, it says bring the mincha lifnei Hashem el pnei hamizbeach. Okay, it says bring it in front of Hashem, in front of to the face of the mizbeach. Now remember, we learned this yesterday, again, or last week if you recorded it ahead, but that Lifnei Hashem always means as close to the Heichal as you can be, right? Which is the west side of the Mizbeach. Pnei HaMizbeach, remember we talked that the Yerach HaMizbeach, the legs of the Mizbeach were the north, so the head of the Mizbeach was the south, right? So the Torah is basically saying do it on the west, and then it's saying do it on the south, right? So the Tanya and the Braita says, how do you reconcile those things? It says Lifnei Hashem. Do the karban mincha in front of Hashem. So you might think Yachal b'ma'arav. Okay, that means you do it on the west side of the Mizbeach, because that's the side that faces the Kodesh, right? Talmud Lomer, therefore the pasuk says, Lifnei Hashem el pnei ha-Mizbeach, on the face of the Mizbeach, which is the south side. It says the Braita, I el pnei ha-Mizbeach Yachal b'darom, so you might think you can do it on the south. Talmud Lomer Lifnei Hashem. Pasuk says Lifnei Hashem. HaKetzad, how do you reconcile these two geographic locations, Lifnei Hashem on the west and Pnei HaMizbeach on the south? You go to the southwest. Megisha b'keren maravit dromit. You bring it to the south, the southwest corner. Keneged chuda shel keren, right next to the edge of the keren of the corner. V'dayo, and that's you fulfilled everything. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, and Rabbi Eliezer doesn't disagree, but he just says it sort of in different language. Yachol, you might think that in fact, Yagishena l'marava shel Karen, that you should push it next to the Mizbeach a little bit north of the corner, meaning to get to be close to Hashem, right? The Fnei Hashem. Ola droma shel Karen, or a little bit to the south of the corner, so that it's in the Pnei HaMizbeach. Amrit, says Rabbi Eliezer, the logic I have is that kol makom shata motzei shnei mikraot. Whenever you find the Torah giving you two instructions, right? And you can fulfill them. There's one way to do something that fulfills this pasuk and the next pasuk and its friend, meaning you can reconcile the two of them. But echad, there's another way to fulfill one pasuk, which only works for one and not for the other. Echad mekayim atzmo mevatel chavero. So obviously it's logical, says Rebbe Eliezer, that you put aside the interpretation that would say, oh, this pasuk is true and the other pasuk is wrong, is mevatel, and you grab onto the thing that can fulfill both psukim. And what's that? How does that translate here? Which again is the same thing as the first Tana. Kshata omer el pnei Hashem b'ma'arav. When you say that you bring the mincha and you place it near, you bring it up to the Mizbeach, Higisho, in front of God, that implies in the west. So how can you fulfill the south, which is the face of the Mizbeach? Then it's bidarom, right? Again, that's the south. Kiyamta, how do you fulfill, then you're Kiyamta l'fnei Hashem. How do you fulfill L'fnei Hashem. Sorry, where am I? Lost my place. If you're bringing, oh yeah, there's different gersolot here also. I'm sorry, that's why I have a little different gersa in mind. But when you say, he takes out the word el, the bach. Kishato mer l'pnei Hashem b'marav hechin yamta el pnei mizbeach. Right, how do you fulfill the south, basically? Kishato mer el pnei mizbeach b'darom. How do you fulfill yamta l'pnei Hashem? Right? So, or the gersa that we have in the Shita has, how do you fulfill that? It's also in the south. So therefore, according to Rebbe Eliezer, the thing has to be done just like the Tanakama on the southwest corner. So basically, you are fulfilling two things here. You're fulfilling that the Karban is done Lifnei Hashem, which is on the west side, and you're fulfilling that it's done in the Pnei HaMizbeach, which is B'darom. Now, ask the Gemara, these last few words are B'darom Hecha Kiyamta, how can it be in the south, right? Depending on where the Mizbeach is located. Says Rav Ashi, you have to realize that Kasavar Haitana Kula Mizbeach B'tzafon Kai. Right? This Tana must hold that the whole Mizbeach is B'tzafon. And what that means is that the whole Mizbeach is in front of the Pnei Ohel Moed. Right? So, because remember, if you have the Mizbeach being, say, halfway or all the way in the south, which were other opinions that we've had earlier this week, then if you're at the south corner of the Mizbeach, you're not Pnei Ohel Moed because you're not in front of the doors, right? And the most Pnei Ohel Moed that we said is in front of the doors. So this Tana must hold, and this is the opinion of Rebbe Eliezer elsewhere, that the Mizbeach was completely in the north, right? Which means that the Mizbeach ends halfway on the Azara. And it's right in front of the door. So if you go to the southwest corner of the Mizbeach, you're both in front of the door of the Ohel Moed, and you're on the south of the Mizbeach, and you've made everyone happy, and that's where you bring the Karban Mincha, and because we compared the Oaf to the Mincha, the Chatat Oaf to the Mincha, that's where you bring the Chatat Oaf as well. Okay, so that is the resolution of that part. Now, tomorrow, we're going to keep going into two dots, but tomorrow we're going to talk about the whole walking up and going backwards and how you know that. That we're not going there yet, but that's the next part of the Mishnah. But what the Mishnah did mention, now at the 2 dots, 7 lines from the bottom, is that in fact, we say you're supposed to do this, right? You're supposed to shecht, do the malika of the bird in the southwest corner, but really, says the Mishnah, really you could do it anywhere, but that's where you're supposed to do it. What does that mean? If you can do it anywhere, what does that mean you're supposed to do it there? If you can do it, is it there or not? So Micah Amar, what does that mean? Amar Rav Ashi, says Rav Ashi, no, this is what it's referring to. Hachikamar, b'chol makom haytak shira the malikata. You can do malika and actually do the shechita, essentially, of the animal anywhere in the Azara. Elazeh haya mikoma lahazata. This is where you have to sprinkle the blood on the Mizbeach. And remember that when you sprinkle the blood of a bird, right, you would just basically push it against the Mizbeach. And so, of course, you basically, if you're smart, you're going to do the malika very close to where you do the sprinkling because you don't have a lot of time. It's not like it's in a kli and you can run it over, right? You've got to just basically take the bird, and you of course need dam hanefesh. You need the essential blood of the bird, and so therefore, they would do it close to the mizbeach. But in fact, you're allowed to do malika anywhere. You just have to do the haza'ah, the sprinkling of the blood, in the southwest corner. Tanina, now in fact, our Mishnah then is telling us this, that the Braita speaks out explicitly. Says the Braita, and this Braita on the surface makes no sense, so we're going to clarify it. But let's just read the words of the Braita. Malka b'chol makom b'mizbeach kshira. If you do malika of a bird for a karban chatat, really, anywhere on the mizbeach, it's kosher. Hiza dama b'chol makom. If you sprinkle the blood on anywhere on the mizbeach, kshira. Okay. But which is not true, but right, we just said it's not true, but that's what the Braita says. Hiza v'lo mitzah. Remember, the hiza is sprinkling the blood, and then they would squeeze, right? So remember, they would basically take it and sprinkle some of it, and then squeeze out the rest and either smear it on the mizbeach or let it come down, drip on the mizbeach. So if you do the haza'ah, but you are not mitzah, you don't squeeze out the remaining blood onto the mizbeach, it's still kshera. It doesn't matter. You're still kosher, meaning that's an extra step. And it's very similar when you have a karban. Remember, an animal, you have to do a zrika of the blood, and then you would pour the shirayim on the mizbeach. Remember, if you didn't do the shirayim, if they got poured out, it would be kosher also. So the mitzah of the bird is similar to the shirayim of an animal, right? Or of a large animal. So says the Braita, but if you're hizav lo mitzah, you're kshera. Ubilvad ends the Braita on the condition sheyitei michut hasikra ulamata midam hanefesh. As long as you put some of the blood of the nefesh, remember that was the blood that's there in the immediate spurt of blood when you kill the animal, when it dies, that some of that blood has to be put on the mizbeach from the chut hasikra and lower. Remember, the chatat ha'of goes below the chut hasikra, the olat ha'of goes up above the sikra, and the animals are the opposite, right? The chatas goes above on the corners, and the ola goes below the animal. But the birds, the chatat ha'of, the chatat ha'of is below, the olat ha'of is above, and the chatat ha'of is below. So that's the Braita. Now, it says in my comment, what's the Braita saying? First, it says you can do it anywhere you want on the mizbeach, and then it says you have to do it below the chut hasikra, right? Which one is true? Hachikamer says there's a little bit missing from this Braita. This is what the Braita means to say. We are 2 lines, I think, from the bottom, right? Hachikamer. Malka b'chol makom b'mizbeach kshira. The malika can be done anywhere on the mizbeach. You don't have to do that in the southwest corner. Mitzadama b'chol makom mizbeach kshira. Right? There's 3 steps. You do malika, you do haza'ah, and then you do mitzah. So you shech the animal, you cut off its head, you do the initial sprinkling of the dam hanefesh. That is the part that has to be done on the southwest corner. Then you squeeze out the rest of the blood anywhere in the mizbeach. So the first step, malika, can be done anywhere in the mizbeach. The mitzah dama, the last step, can be done at b'chol makom mizbeach kshira. However, and the reason that's kosher, says the Braita on top of daf samach dalad amud aleph, she'em hizav lo mitzah kshira. Because the truth is that if you did haza'ah and you didn't even do mitzah at all, right? You did the initial sprinkling, but you didn't do any of the squeezing, it would be kosher. That's not an indispensable part of the animal, of the karban. So it doesn't really matter where you do it, because you don't even have to do it. But what does matter is the haza'ah. Ubilvad sheyitain michut hasikra ulamata midam hanefesh. As long as for the dam hanefesh, the original blood that's spurting out, that's the haza'ah, you have to do that on the southwest corner below the chut hasikra. And that is why the Mishnah says, in fact, you can actually do the malika anywhere you want, but you can't do the haza'ah anywhere you want, and therefore it makes sense to do the malika next to the southwest corner where you're going to do the haza'ah. So they would go there in order to do the sacrifice. And we will stop here because we're done with the daf. It's still very exciting and fresh. Pick it up from there tomorrow, where we get into the next details of the Mishnah, which is, first of all, how you know the rest of the things, right? We said there's 6 things, 3 above and 3 below. We just learned 2 of them. And furthermore, how you know that you walk up and go to the left and not to the right like you normally would do. So that's very exciting. So more to come. Shavua Tov, everyone. It's a fun daf.
Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
We'll see you all. Take care.
You're here next week?
I'm here in person.
Okay.
Okay. Bye.